Welcome everybody to what is episode 3 of the 1 year later webinar series, a sequel to the new normal webinar series that we did about a year ago around this time. The title of today's conversation and webinar is the impact of the election on infrastructure and local government spending. So obviously over the past year and a half, our country has undergone a ton of forced change due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We've been quarantined. Businesses have been forced to shut down. We're now, at the point where vaccine distribution is scaling exponentially. Businesses are starting to open back up. And obviously, one sort of big elephant in the room is we have a new presidential administration as well. With that comes a whole host of new legislative priorities, different topics and areas that Congress is focused on funding, and that's really going to be the main sort of area that we discuss today, is the impact of the election on infrastructure and local government spending. We have a heavy hitter guest today that I'm really excited about, and I'm going to introduce him in a little bit. Very accomplished individual, but before I do so, a couple of quick housekeeping items. And I'm sorry if they sound familiar because you were an attendee of the past couple of weeks. The first one is this webinar will be available on demand after it concludes. So we'll post it on the eBuilder website 2 to 3 days, maybe even sooner after we're finished. So if you need to leave halfway through, we understand. This will be accessible on demand. Secondly, you will receive an email of a certificate of participation. So if your employer is requiring that, or a manager, you will receive that in your email inbox. One of my co-hosts today, Dan Connery for short, is going to be fielding Q&A questions throughout the entire show. So the entire sort of I guess you could say what the young people say vibe. The entire vibe of this show today will be very conversational and informal in format. So Dan and I will be poking the bear a little bit with Norm and engaging in frequent discussion and potentially even pushing back on several items. So the whole intent of this is not to be a lecture. It's a very open format sort of conversation. So on your right-hand side of the GoToWebinar control panel, you should see a questions tab or a bar where you can insert your questions as they come up throughout the conversation. We are first come, first serve. So we don't always get to all of them, but if you have something that pops into your mind, please submit it as soon as possible. But like I said, first come, first serve. So we hope to get to all of them. With that said, I am going to introduce our guest. Norm Anderson is the chairman and CEO of CGLA Infrastructure. He's a regular contributor to CNBC, Bloomberg, CBC, Fox Business News, literally every media conglomerate under the sun. You have probably seen his face on your television. An extremely accomplished individual, very in the know, plugged in with what's happening on the Hill in DC, and really has spent the better of, 3 decades now working in DC. So quite an accomplished individual. He even speaks 4 languages. He might even transition to different languages throughout this conversation if he wants to confuse us. So Norm, I gave the audience a little bit of a preface of you and your career, but why don't you tell us, a little bit about yourself in your own words?
Sure, I'll be really quick, and thanks for the introduction. I haven't worked in DC for 3 decades. My goodness, that would be horrible. I've lived around DC for 3 decades, but I work all over the place, all over the world and all over the US. So huge amount of traveling. What I like to do is talk to people and understand what their issues are. And our focus, I actually started the firm 34 years ago. The focus has always been on individual infrastructure projects, what it takes to get those projects moving, and who supports them, and how do you maximize the benefits of those projects. Just to give you a very quick overview of my career, the relevant part, I lived in Latin America for 5 years as a Peace Corps volunteer, and 9-hour bus ride, 7-hour walk into the jungle, living with Guarani Indians, teaching in a one-room schoolhouse, first, second, and third grade in Guarani, which, by the way, is the answer to the trivia question: what's the second most used language in the world for scientific terminology after Latin? Is Guarani, because it was spoken all through the Amazon basin, down the coast of Brazil, and up into Paraguay, just in case anybody is faced with that question. One of the things I think is endlessly, I think there are a couple of things about infrastructure right now that are really, really relevant. One of them is that I see infrastructure leading the largest industrial change we have seen since the advent of the internal combustion engine. So this current period of digitization and electrification is a big deal. And the second part of that is that infrastructure all of a sudden becomes a first order priority. It's no longer the substrate that allows the economy to be productive. It becomes the brains of the economy. And increasingly, it's going to determine what I call what I stole from somebody, calling it the architecture of opportunity. It's going to be defined by infrastructure and how we design it and how well we do at implementing it and managing it going forward. So I suppose that's a good enough introduction. The other thing that is maybe relevant is that it doesn't matter how you invest in infrastructure. Infrastructure is a public good, right? Whether it's the private sector investing, it's a public good. And so, you know, my office right here, right now, is right across the street from the White House, because there really is an intersection between what we try to do with infrastructure and public policy. And if you believe that now is the biggest change in 120 years, which it is, so you have to believe that, it means that public policy needs to change and our institutions need to change and adapt. So there's a lot to, I suppose, unpack, Evan, in terms of this conversation. So that's my introduction, and hopefully I've worked through all your first 25, 30 questions, and we can move on from there.
Well, I want to sort of start with a softball question. We're day 90 or 91, I think, into the Biden administration. Obviously, the stimulus was sort of priority number one, the stimulus package that recently passed Congress and was signed into law. It's clear that the infrastructure bill is now the next sort of legislative big item of, you know, that Biden wants to pass. What's really interesting about this conversation is it's very real time. Like, news could break next hour, you know, that the Republicans have put forth, you know, a counter proposal. We'll see. We're seeing numbers. I think I saw numbers yesterday that the Republicans had countered with 800 billion. I know Biden has gone up to 4 trillion. I know some moderate Senate Democrats said even up to 4 trillion. I think Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia said that this past week. So let me start you off with a sort of softball question. Why is infrastructure spending a priority right now for the Biden administration?
How is that a softball question?
Well, I guess it's not a question. I lied.
What's really interesting is that we are so overdue for a strategic infrastructure initiative. And, you know, if you start to connect the dots, Evan, and in terms of what I just said, in terms of what different people see in terms of their needs around infrastructure, it really is a first priority issue, a first level issue. So the trick here is to figure out if there's any evidence that the Biden administration is actually going to be successful with an infrastructure initiative. Because why is it an important issue? It's an important issue because, you know, our average infrastructure assets are between 50 and 60 years old. We have about $40 trillion, almost twice our GDP, invested in infrastructure. Those are old assets, as I said. But, you know, when I ask you what infrastructure means, it doesn't mean the same thing as it probably meant to Joe Biden when he was talking about Build Back Better, which he doesn't do anymore. it all of a sudden means a lot more of the things that I was talking about earlier, digitization and electrification, so 5G, AI, that kind of thing. So we're really looking at figuring out how to organize ourselves and organize a country strategy for the future while satisfying some of the urgent needs of our citizens. It's a real balancing act. But do we need infrastructure? Yes. Does infrastructure bring a lot of your priorities and my priorities and Dan's priorities together? It certainly does. So the issue around do we need infrastructure? Why an infrastructure initiative? Why is it number 2 is important? But the other part of that is that when you say we're at day 91, that worries me a lot, right? Because you want to get infrastructure out of the box a lot earlier than the first 100 days. You want to be blowing and going. And so I think there's a significant sense of urgency in the White House to get this thing moving. And I think that there's a pretty significant sense of urgency in the Congress to get this thing moving, whatever this thing is.
So if I could jump in, Evan, real quick. So you talk about digitization and electrification. So why don't you define for us infrastructure? It's a very small word that can mean a lot of things. What do you define infrastructure as?
So I go pretty far toward the Biden definition of infrastructure in terms of anything having to do with transportation of people and also molecules, things with molecules, but also anything having to do with energy and the generation of electrons, the transmission of electrons, the delivery of electrons, especially renewable energy to you, base load in terms of hydrogen, water, wastewater, huge part of what we do, plus travel by water. And then the third one is social infrastructure. For me, includes educational facilities, and it includes hospitals, medical facilities, and even clinics in rural areas connected to our system by broadband. So and it involves all the ICT as well. So that's a broad, old definition of infrastructure. That's all included. But what it means going forward is the electrification of vehicles. It means autonomy. It means the generation of big data. It means the use of data the way we used to use gasoline in terms of either taxing it or putting a fee on data so that it provides revenue for the public sector to invest in new infrastructure and new capability as well. So the digitization, for instance, of our interstate highway system, where you would put 5G posts every 100 yards, and all of a sudden you create an autonomous speedway for trucks, which creates a logistics end-to-end system in the US, which then enables local advanced manufacturing and local advanced agriculture. So there's a big vision. You guys know that I just published a book called Vision, our Strategic Infrastructure Roadmap Forward. And the purpose of the book was to say that it's ours, it's us. I mentioned Guarani a minute ago, and it's the only language I know where when I say us, there's actually 2 different words for say us. I could say me without you guys, so that would be Washington without the country, or I could say Ore, which is all of us, right? And that's what I'm talking about. That vision brings us all together and pushes us forward in a direction where it looks to me we can all live a better life, designing the future that we want to live in. And I think that's a bipartisan vision.
So continuing on the theme of bipartisanship, obviously none of this matters, or this conversation doesn't even matter if the bill never passes. So I want to briefly spend time on this topic in question from a political strategy point of view. What is the Biden administration and what do Democrats in Congress need to do to ensure they have enough votes to make sure they have some of those more moderate Senate Democrats like Sinema from Arizona, Manchin from West Virginia, make sure they're on board to pass this sort of bill. So what needs to happen to make sure this passes the world of Congress?
I think the number one thing is that you have to get involved, and the people who are listening have to get involved. I was talking to Senator Warner a couple of years ago, and he said, "Look, Norm, if you really want to do this," I don't know if he said, "Look, Norm," I'm not sure he knew who I was. He said, "Look, buddy, if you want to do this, right, it requires people out in the country to talk to their congressmen and talk to their senators, because I can't convince these people in a vacuum, right?" And that's what's really, really important. You know, I'm not flogging my book, but another thing that I highlighted in the book, because I was trying to get at this point, is how can a great country continue to talk about infrastructure investment year after year? And, you know, you chop down a small Canadian forest every time there's an infrastructure initiative. And how can you do that and not do it and not get anything done? And I think the biggest answer to that question is people need to mobilize. You know, the people on this call need to mobilize and need to communicate as powerfully as they possibly can to their senators and congressmen that they need stuff. And then Washington has to come up with a strategy or a vision that brings all those ideas together into something that we can believe in. And just to give you guys a quick example, and I know the listeners are, or the viewers are very aware of this, the initial Biden stimulus has $360 billion in it that it's being distributed directly to counties across the US. But the rules aren't there in terms of how they can spend that money. And we're not thinking particularly clearly about what our priorities are either. And since everybody's stretched pretty thinly, some people are going to invest in water, some people are going to invest in repaving highways, some people are going to invest in the local library, the local school. We don't have a coherent strategy, but what we need, and what's really important, I think, is to make sure that people let their congressmen know, Republicans, Democrats, right down the middle, that this is in fact a priority. And guess what? You have to get something done. We don't care if you get everything done, but you've got to get something done this time.